Welcome Wargamers, my name is Doug from Do Plus Stuff, and recently on the channel, the last couple months, I've been talking more and more about the game Conquest, Last Argument of Kings by Bellum out of Greece. It's an incredibly interesting game that provides a lot of unique decision-making opportunities, far more so than I've seen with other large-scale wargames. And so to celebrate the launch of their 1.5 edition, where they took a whole bunch of community feedback and integrated it into the rules to clean it up quite a bit, to celebrate that, I'm going to do a kind of a demonstration of how the game functions on any given turn, because in doing so, you're going to see exactly what makes the game so unique. To be clear, this is not a tutorial, like I'm not going to go through every single rule step by step, although I will do that later, so don't worry about that. This is instead meant to be a shorter video that's just meant to highlight what makes the game unique, to kind of like whet your palate or kind of get your interest in a very succinct and short way. Now, unfortunately, I don't have two fully painted armies to be able to show you, so what I'm going to do instead is over on the shared screen, go into the TTS files they have, Tabletop Simulator. Bellum themselves has put a lot of work into creating a very beautiful, with 3D models and everything like that, version of their game, and so I'm going to use that to demonstrate a few things and kind of explain how a turn works. Some things I'm going to kind of breeze over a little bit, and at the end of the video I'll come back and explain them further. This is just mainly so we don't get bogged down in way too much detail. I want to keep things moving and kind of keep information kind of minimal. If you like what you see and you're interested in the game, I do have an affiliate link down below. It goes a long way to supporting me and my wife and the channel, as well as giving you 10% off any of your purchases through Bellum. So without further ado, let's head over to the battlefield and check it out. So here we are on the main battle screen. As you can see, they have quite an extensive thing of mods for all the different tokens and that kind of stuff you would ever need. Honestly, you're not going to use like 90% of the stuff on this, so don't worry too much about it if it seems a bit much. They just have a ton of extra resources so that no matter what game variant you're playing, you can jump right in. On the table here, I have marked out as two different forces. We have the Spires and the 100 Kingdoms, and I'll kind of do an aerial view right now from behind. This is our Imperial officer, a hero or character inside a unit of militia, which is the kind of basic infantry of the 100 Kingdoms. And as a mirror match, I have a High Clone Executor, which is a model we explored or will explore in the list building episode, and his kind of lowest tier infantry unit of Force Grown Drone. So we're going to be using these guys to kind of just show you and give you a sense of what makes this game unique. Now, much like other wargames, Conquest is split into a whole bunch of phases per turn. So first off, you have the reinforcements phase, where you see if any of your models that aren't not yet on the board come into the board. So it happens right at the top of the turn. You get to know what's coming in. After that, there is the command phase, where essentially you prioritize what order your units activate. Because unlike other wargames where you do all of your units and then your opponent does all of their units, and then that's how it kind of goes from, you know, my turn and your turn. Instead, Conquest is actually an I go, you go game. So I will activate a single unit and then you will activate a single unit, and we go back and forth until everything's been activated. The trick to that, though, is you have to determine what order your units are going to activate before the game round starts. And so that is a huge bit of tactical tax that goes into your brain. Now, the nice thing is that once you've established the order, you know, then you can kind of take it as it comes when you reveal what unit activates next. At that point, you have total freedom to do whatever you want with them. So there's not like, you're not locked into a strategy necessarily, but just the order in which things activate becomes very important. So command phase is when you basically divvy up what units are going to activate and when. After that, there is the Supremacy Phase, and this is really just, there are some cards that have abilities that go on here. So like the Supremacy Phase, really the only thing that you do at this point is just determine who has priority, right? Who has the first activation in the I go, you go thing. It just also is a phase because some unique abilities and that kind of thing trigger in it. After that is the action phase, where again, that's where the actual game is played, where you select a unit, or you reveal the command card, which we'll talk about in a second, that tells your opponent which unit you're going to activate, and then you get two actions with them. Once you go, I go, you go, I go, you go, until all of the units have activated. After that is the final phase, which is the victory phase, where you just count up victory points and see if the mission's been won or lost and by how much. So now what I'd like to do is move over back to the table, and we'll walk through each of these phases really quickly with these very simple forces. Keep in mind, there are, like any wargame, a bajillion rules to modify how those phases interact with one another, buffs and debuffs, in that time of space. So understand, like, this is a very simple thing. I'm keeping it as minimal as possible just to show off some of the cool mechanics. So here we are back at the table. We're going to kind of breeze past the reinforcement phase. I'm going to talk more about it at the end of the video because it requires a little bit more context. When it comes to the command phase, which is the next one, this is where the game gets really interesting, to be perfectly honest with you. Each unit in the game has a card associated with it. We can take a look here. There we go, Force-Grown Drones and High Clone Executor. In this phase of the game, you are going to be determining the order that your units activate for the rest of the turn. As I said before, it's I go, you go, but you have to lock yourself into a battle plan before the round begins. There are a myriad of really cool interactions that happen with this, though. We'll talk about them here in a little bit, but that concept of locking yourself into a battle plan at the start of every turn becomes very interesting, okay? It's a simple concept, but when we talk about the actual mechanics that this game has for certain factions, most notably the Spire, that becomes a really cool tool and design system. So, what we're going to do, let's do this. Let's flip them over, and we're going to throw the High Clone Executor on top because I want him to go first, okay? And that's all we would do for the command phase. Again, there's only 2 units. If you had units that came in during the reinforcement phase, they're technically off the board, but you would still put their card in the mix. So that would be when you flip that card, then they would come onto the table. So nothing else changes. It's just every unit that is or will be on the battlefield this round gets a card. You put them in the correct order that you want them to be, and your deck is set. This is called the command deck right here. One thing that is important, and I'll just show this right fast. If you'll notice on their card, it just says Force-Grown Drones, right? One thing I wanted to point out is that if you have multiples of the same unit and you draw a card for one of them, you can choose any of them. So if I had 2 units of Force-Grown Drones and I draw this card, it's not like I'm locked into picking a specific unit. Whichever one I want to have activate can. The same goes for characters, large monsters, everything. So if you have multiples of stuff, you have a little bit more freedom in choosing, which one activates. Now the next phase of the game is called the Supremacy Phase. This is essentially where we determine who has the priority for that round. In this scenario, I'm just going to say the Spire has it. Essentially what you would normally do is you would roll off, and the person with the fewest number of units on the table, coming in from reserve, anything like that, that's going to be on the going on this round, they get either a +1 or -1 to their die roll. So essentially, it kind of leans a little bit in the favor of whoever has the fewest troops, but it doesn't just give them the turn. And there are also a few abilities, most notably that are on characters, like the High Clone Executor has an ability that can go off once per game in the Supremacy Phase. I'm not going to worry about that too much. It's too small of a game to really use it anyway. But essentially that's something they can do. It's more just a marker for this is where you determine who has priority and some cool abilities that very specific models have. Now, next up is the action phase, and this is where the bulk of the game is, right? The rest of this stuff goes through very, very quickly. I'm not even really going to talk about the victory phase because it's just counting command points or whatever the mission details, the win condition by. And so, that one I'm going to put off to the side, but let's talk about the action phase in this video. When it is your turn, as I said, the Spire has priority, you're going to flip that top card. So let's do this. We'll flip it and boom, the High Clone Executor activates. Now at this point, something very interesting happens. A term that you're going to see a lot in this game is something called a draw event. What that means is when the character card that's relevant is flipped over, a draw event immediately activates, okay? So let's say, for example, for the purposes of this, I gave my High Clone Executor a special ability called Bastion, okay? When I have a draw event, meaning I flip the High Clone Executor, immediately him and his unit gain the special rule, Bastion, which just increases their defense by 1. The reason that this is so interesting is because that rule, even though I paid for it with points, does not come into effect until the High Clone Executor has activated. So it kind of, when you talk about how to structure and order your command deck, what order things should activate, draw events are a massive part of the strategy in that. Because if I had activated, say, the Force-Grown Drones first, I could move and charge and attack and do all kinds of cool stuff, but I wouldn't have Bastion activated until the High Clone Executor went. And draw events are really the core mechanic that allows a lot of tactical depth for this game. The order in which you activate things is super important, but also equally important is the fact that, like, you can add a ton of draw events. You can only ever pick one. There's some ways that you can manipulate the game through, like, artifacts and stuff to be able to have multiple for some armies. It's where a lot of the flavorful rules are draw events. So when you activate this character, they do their cool thing that you brought them for. No dice rolls, nothing like that. And the reason I really appreciate that as a design idea is because there's nothing less fun than bringing all these cool characters and units, but they don't get to do their special thing. Draw events ensure that when you activate a unit, they do the thing that you designed them to do. All that's left up to the equation is, when do you activate them, right? Is it smarter to go sooner, later, and so on? To give you a quick sense of like how this mechanic is used, the Spire, for example, the faction that I'm currently being, not so much with this specific leader, but they have another unit and character called the Biomancer. And he has all kinds of crazy draw events where you can draw his card and immediately another unit in your army can activate. So it kind of subverts the order of activations in terms of I go, you go, and allows for very powerful ambushing tactics and things like that. Other things will allow you to say, this draw event is basically the next card that you draw gets a bonus, whether they get better at attacking or defending. So now that changes the order in which you want things to be drawn. Now, after any draw events, either yours or your opponent's, have been resolved, then you can get to do 2 actions with the unit that you activated. Now, I'm going to kind of breeze past it here because the High Clone Executor essentially doesn't really do much in this specific context. When you have a hero attached to a unit, essentially the unit carries them along, and sometimes heroes can do special actions, and we'll talk about that in a future video. But they can do a move here, so I'll tell you what. Let's go over to the 100 Kingdoms and see how they're doing. So now that the Spires have gone, again, I activated the High Clone Executor to make sure that the Force-Grown Drones that he's with have their +1 defense from Bastion. So now it's the other player's turn. Now we're sitting here with the 100 Kingdoms. I flipped my card and I got the Militia. Now, the interaction between characters and their units they're attached to is a little bit hard to understand at first. Once you get your mind around it, it's really simple. But because I drew the Militia, the unit itself as a whole can move and activate. If you draw the character card, like for the High Clone Executor, he can't move the entire unit. But when the unit's card comes up, then they can move and do all their stuff. And you get 2 actions with every unit when it's activated, and these are just basic things: move, charge, retreat, reform, that kind of stuff. Very, very simple, very intuitive and straightforward. What I would say that are really interesting, though, are the 2 abilities called Inspire, and what's the other one called? Take Aim. And these are really great because they are bonuses to your ability to do damage instinctively. Every single unit in the game has access to a +1 to hit when it comes to melee, which is Inspire, or ranged attacks, which is just, Take Aim. And so, I don't know why it's so hard for me to remember. Anyway, we're going to do something really simple. In this example, we're going to have the Militia charge into the Spire. Keep in mind that in Conquest, charging does not mean you get to move and attack. it means you move into melee and you inspire, which means you get +1 to your hit for free. So you charge, and then your second action can be an attack. Or if you're in a weird situation, you could honestly do it in such a way where you attack first, kill whatever you're engaged with, and then charge something else to tie them down. There's a lot of playability there. It's very cool, but we'll keep it simple here. We're going to go ahead and charge with them. Now for their first action, they're going to head and declare a charge, at which point you will roll a single d6 and add it to their movement value. That is the total charge distance that they have. So it's your movement plus d6. So we're going to go ahead and roll a die, and it's kind of arbitrary because I want to say that they're going to get in no matter what, just for the purposes of a tutorial. 5 inches is more than enough. Boom, right up in their faces. So because they charged, not only do they move into combat, but they also inspire, meaning that any attacks that they do this round are going to have +1 to hit. This is called the clash value. Instead of to hit, to wound rolls, they have the clash value. So here's an aerial view of our melee, and we can see with the cool little reference cards here. Oh, sorry about that. They have a movement of 5, a volley of 1, doesn't matter. Volley is your ranged attack. A clash of 1, which is now 2 because we charged in. Now essentially one thing that separates this game from many others is that you're trying to roll d6s to go equal to or under your stat. So a clash value of 1 means on 1s you will hit. Again, these are the garbage units of both of these respective factions, right? They're not meant to kill stuff. So you're going to roll a d6 and you're trying to get 1 or less. In this case, because they inspired and charged in and whatever, they're looking for 1s and 2s. For their attack, that 1 attack each. So what we're going to do is look at this unit and see how many we have in combat. Each of these stands has 4 models. Each model has an attack value. So that means 4, 8, 12 are going to be attacking. 3 stands, meaning the actual square that has 4 dudes on it. 3 stands seems to be the typical for all infantry units. I can't really recall one that's less than that, but that seems to be like the starting size for most of them. So 12 dudes, no matter what. Again, if their attack was 2, then for each model, like individual dude on these stands, they would get 2 attacks. There's a little bit more to learn when it comes to how different ranks work. So if we had, for example, I'll just move this as an example. If we went 2 ranks deep, the stands in the back who are not directly in combat would normally only contribute 1 attack, regardless of their attack stat. They would just throw 1 additional die, not per guy, just 1 die in there. There are special rules that they have, like they have, what is their rule called? Support, which basically anything with like a tall spear has support, where they just get an additional die to throw into the pile. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's just stands that aren't in combat provide 1 extra die unless they have support, and then it's 2. But we come over here to our little dice roller thinger jigger. I don't really know what to call it. We got 12 dice. Again, there's 12 guys attacking, and we're looking for 2s or less. Okay, sorry about that. I had a little glitch trouble. We're going to go ahead and roll our 12 dice. That's 1 die for each attack. And it looks like we have gotten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 successes. Wow, 6 out of 1s and 2s. That is quite incredible. Okay, so we have 6 dice that are going to go into our enemies over here. And so we're going to take a look at the stats for the Force-Grown Drone. I'm just going to tell you what it is. Their defense value is 2 right now. It's a base of 1, and then they get +1 from the Bastion draw event that came from the High Clone Executor. Again, he was playing defensive, so I flipped that card first to make sure they got the bonus. So we're going to go down to 6, because that's what went through. And we are looking for 1s and 2s, so we will roll those. And it looks like we had 3 successes and 3 fails. So here is how the game gets crazy devastating, okay? We're going to take away 3 models from one of these units, and then we're going to do immediately this game's version of Battle Shock, which is simply known as rallying. Okay, so at this point, the militia have dealt 3 damage to the unit. As you can see, I took away 3 guys there, but now they immediately have to see basically who runs away as a result from the casualties taken. To do that, we're going to come back over here to our dice roller machine, and essentially, because 3 wounds were suffered, we're going to roll 3 dice. Any of these dice that are not equal to or lower than their rally score is going to be another casualty. Now, a few notes here. One, most importantly, ranged attacks do not cause rally tests. It's important because, you know, melee is meant to be brutal, and it really is in this game. But shooting, they didn't want it to be a shooting meta, and so you're not going to run away from taking shots. It's just mechanically, it would be too aggressive in favor of shooting. So what we're going to do is we took 3 of them. They have a bravery stat of 1, but hey, here's the cool thing about characters. We can actually use his, and he has a rally stat of 4, which is wonderful. That's why characters are so great in this. So we will go ahead and roll those. And they got all 5s, so 3 more guys are going to run away. Oh man, even with that great score, I love it. So there's going to be 1, and we'll go and just get rid of 2 more here. And boom, that was a successful attack on the part of the militia. At this point, everything is resolved, and it would go back over to the Spire player's turn. And so with that attack sequence done, right, the battle shock was taken and all that, the activation for the militia ends because they don't have any more actions to be able to do anything. Now, in a regular game, I'm not going to do it now just for the interest of time, but in a normal game, at this point, the hero in the unit would attack as well, because he activates as part of the regiment that he is attached to. So not only would you get the militiamen, you would also get the hero, and I'm not going to do it just because I don't have any special rules or anything that would make that any more interesting, but that's essentially how it functions. So aside from taking buffs and stuff like that, why would you have heroes in a unit? Well, they can also do this thing called Duels. When you draw your character's card and they're already in melee, I'm just going to use this as an example here. We're past the I go, you go thing. This is, like I said, not a tutorial. But in this situation, if the Imperial officer would activate next, he, using his action, could declare a challenge to the High Clone Executor, and the 2 of them specifically would fight head-to-head. This is a great way to snipe out characters. Some factions, specifically the Dweghome and the Nords, love challenges and duels because they can snipe out important pieces of their opponent's army because their heroes are so strong that they want challenges. If you refuse a challenge, there's a lot of consequences for it. Again, brutal game in terms of melee and stuff dying. Absolutely love it. But that's the core of how the gameplay functions. And now, of course, after this turn is completed, it would go to the Spire's turn. They would flip their next card for the Force-Grown Drones, and then they would be able to inspire and attack back. And then at the end of the round, we just see who has more victory points or whatever based on the mission. So that completes the overview of the kind of game round itself, but there were a few things that I wanted to touch here on the end, specifically 3 of them. So how reinforcements work in Conquest, how the deployment line functions, and that's kind of an interesting concept there, and army building. So as I mentioned before, there is a reinforcements phase. Every unit in the game has either a marker as a light unit, a medium unit, or a heavy unit. It doesn't matter if it's infantry or monsters or brutes, they all fit into one of those 3 categories, light, medium, heavy. That dictates when those units come on the board. There's a handy little chart I'll show up here for you right now, where essentially you don't start with any models on the table, but you instead roll to see when they come on, and at certain turns they just automatically come on. Now keep in mind, with characters, there's a lot of ways to kind of manipulate that. You can have a character on, say, a light unit, so the character gets to come on early, even if the character is like medium or heavy. Vice versa, you can have a character that allows them to come on earlier, if they're a heavy unit, through artifacts and special abilities and things like that. Now, when I first saw this, I was like, well, why would I want to play a game where I can't have, my toys on the table as much as possible? And it's important to remember that with Conquest, games last for many more turns. So because those early turns are a lot of positioning and movement, they go by extremely fast. I cannot emphasize that enough. A standard game of like Age of Sigmar or War Machine and Hordes will have about 5 to 6 rounds. I mean, honestly, sometimes you can just call it on the top of like 3. Conquest typically has about 10 turns. So you might see it like, oh, my heavy unit can't even kind of come on the table until, turn 3 or 4. Well, that's okay. They have plenty of time to make it up the table and start doing things. Like your skirmish units come on first, then your rank and file, and then your heavy hitters come in and clean some clocks at the end. Now, the deployment line is an interesting concept that I haven't seen in any other wargame. The first round, your units come on through your table edge. Makes perfect sense. But you might be thinking to yourself, well, if I have heavy units and they don't have a high movement value, then even when they come on, a third of the way through the game, they still have to literally march all the way up to the combat. And that's where the idea of a deployment line comes in. Whatever your farthest forward unit is, their back edge counts as your new deployment zone. So you can come on from a table edge that's just behind your furthermost forward unit. This is how you can get huge monsters and heavy, slower armored, troops who have a low movement value. They come in on the board side as far up as your forces have pushed the line of battle. And sure, that first time it might be, you move onto the board and then maybe like reposition or wheel to be able to engage next turn, but they are there right where the combat is happening. So I've set up this little scene for us here where, I just have one stand of force-grown drones. They're walking up to the militia. The units are not important, of course, in this example. But if we zoom out to see the rest of the board, I'm just on the edge to make it easier to see. But the furthest forward unit for the Spire is up here. Their back base, like the back line of their stand, covers a line that goes all the way across the board like this, okay? So what I can do as a Spire player is if it's time for my big monster, my abomination to come in, he can actually come in, boom, right there. Now again, he will have to use his first action to move onto the table. Luckily, abominations have an incredible movement value. They are terrifying, by the way. And then for his second action, he can reposition and boom. There are a few more rules around this kind of a thing, but truthfully, that's just the nitty-gritty. The main one being it's your furthest forward unit that doesn't have any enemies into your deployment zone. So what I mean is, if this unit had run forward, well, he can't come in right into their face. He has to be behind the furthest forward base that doesn't have an enemy behind it. So if there was, say this situation happened, right? We have our first most forward unit there, but we have an enemy unit behind them. I can't come in behind him, so it just goes to the next furthermost forward unit with no enemies behind them, so it would be here. So still further up the board, burp, and there we go. He has to walk on from the side, so he'll start like this, lined up with the furthest forward, most back edge, and then he can turn. So this is a really cool way of like, again, the big monster, the abomination, is a heavy unit. He is going to be coming in later in the game, but because you can set your deployment line as you are acting aggressively, that works out. Now, the flip side of that is equally true. If you're playing defensively and you're trying to hold objectives, it is really helpful to have, big heavy units that are slower come in from your table edge, maybe might be closer to the objectives you're trying to hide. You have total freedom. So if you are doing this here, let's take a look at our table. Again, this abomination can come in anywhere along this table edge or anything up the sides on both sides, as long as it's, again, meets those criteria for being behind your furthest, most forward unit without any enemies behind them. So because of all those things combined, the extra turns and the way the deployment line moves and gives you more room the more aggressively you play, it might seem a bit strange to say that you don't start with every unit on the table, but your most valuable units, the heavy ones who do the most damage, are off the table and cannot be hurt until they show up where they need to be. They can move up the table quicker because the deployment line thing, and then they can actually deliver the punch that you expect them to. And I have to say that's one thing that this sort of mechanic allows for, is that because your units don't start on the table, they will be able to reach most of their targets unmolested. I mean, truthfully, between being able to start further up the board, coming in later in the game when maybe some, you know, lighter units that would kind of plink off wounds here and there are already defeated, and the fact that, like, shooting doesn't cause morale checks like we talked about before, all of a sudden your heavy guys who, like, you paid a lot of points for and are probably the coolest models in your army show up and, like, do cool things, and I love that. There's not going to be any of this, like, getting blown off the board, you know, turn 2 because of a shooting meta type thing. Your units simply aren't there to be shot, and when they show up, they can come up way further up the board, up your opponent's nose, and start delivering punches. Now, as far as list building goes, that is a very large topic that I'm going to save for another video, probably immediately after this one, because I want to talk about how character creation works, because there's so many levers that you can pull when it comes to character design that modify the game state that we talked about here this entire time. Everything from affecting when units come on the board, how they can capture objectives, their movement values. Sometimes they can give units extra actions or supersede the turn order so that you can have 2 activations for your opponent's 1. All kinds of crazy things, and so it really does require its own video. Characters are what make these armies fun, interesting, and flavorful, and also dictate what units you can take. So anyway, friends, I think that'll do it for your taste of Conquest. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I'm also going to have a link to the official Conquest Discord. It's a wonderful place where the actual creators and staff of Parabellum are constantly interacting with their fan base. They're a very welcoming community and very helpful if you have questions about the game. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.